What if Minecraft were a lot closer to real life? What if it were as difficult as life in the Industrial Revolution, where food is scarce, water is dirty, and winters are cold, and you can easily die of malnutrition, the pollution created by your own furnaces, and, of course, severe weather that can appear at any moment and rip through your land? Could you survive all this and more? And I don't mean survive as in not dying, because you will die. I mean survive as in not letting the land become a barren wasteland of pollution and dead trees. My goal for this 100 days is to create a massive multi-block excavator and have enough infrastructure to successfully operate it. But all the while, pollution levels will slowly build, threatening all life in the world, and the possibility for severe storms remains ever present. Can I survive 100 days in the Industrial Revolution? That's what we'll find out in this video. If you guys enjoyed this video and want me to survive 200 days, then be sure to hit the like button, 10,000 likes, and I'll do a part 2. Also, if you haven't already, consider subscribing. I'm trying to get to 50,000 subscribers by June, and I need your help. Also, quick announcement, my Patreon is now active, and for $5 a month, you can have access to schematics of many of my builds, including the Architon Slight Cruiser and my 1/3 skill Venator Star Destroyer once it's finished. Follow the link in the description to my Patreon page, where you can find more details. Luckily for me, I did not spawn in an extreme biome where I could die of cold or heat stroke immediately, and I set about exploring the area around me and attempting to gather some flint and sticks because I can't just punch trees and make wood tools. Wood tools literally do not even exist here. The starting season is the summer, meaning that it is possible for me to overheat in the prairie as it's a warmer biome, but it will be beneficial to me in the winter to come. My first objective is to get some flint and then smash that flint on stone to turn it into flint shards, which I could then use to turn into basic tools. With my flint shard, I crafted a flint knife so that I could cut grass and obtain grass fibers to make grass twine, which I could then use to make slightly more complicated tools like a hatchet later on. A mere few minutes into the world and I was already dehydrated and I was forced to drink river water, which gave me the thirst status effect. So there's this neat thing about trees in this mod pack where if you chop them down, they actually fall over like real trees, and that also means that you can die if you have a tree fall on you, which is not a neat thing. I then set about making a crafting table by using my hatchet on logs to gather planks, which is a lot more of a pain than it is in normal Minecraft. And I also had to use rocks to craft cobble because you don't get a full cubic meter of cobblestone with flint tools. After a little bit of mining, I was able to upgrade some of my tools to stone, but night was already falling and I needed to gather resources and food fast if I was going to survive. But I was immediately faced with the problem of poor food because, you see, in real life you're not going to be able to go out and eat one piece of raw corn and expect it to nourish you. And that's the case here as well. You have to take lots of food items and combine them into more complicated recipes to actually gain proper hunger and saturation. I unwittingly created my first bit of pollution while mining coal down in a cave, and this was in the form of carbon dioxide, which if left unchecked and in great enough quantities would eventually kill me. I had a nasty run-in with a few zombies and a baby zombie, but I was able to survive only by pillaring up with some dirt, and that allowed me to kill them, but it made me realize that I needed shelter. Luckily, there was a village nearby that I could seek refuge in. I was pleasantly surprised to be greeted by a sleeping American Yorkshire piglet, which was very adorable in the village. As the moon set behind a hill in the distance, I was finally able to obtain some shelter with a special villager. Apparently he's a machinist, but I don't really have anything to trade for at the moment. However, there was some nice loot in his house that would be very beneficial, especially that steel axe. On the morning of the second day, I continued grabbing some loot from the house of the villager, and there's actually some decent stuff and several tools that would come in handy later. And a neat thing about the storage crates is that they actually act like discount shulker boxes. Oh, and I decided to grab that hammer because I think I'll need it later. After a brief encounter with a skeleton where I almost died, I decided to get some more food, and you can see here that these baked potatoes only restore half of a hunger shank, and they don't give me very much saturation. I then decided to get a little bit of resources, and I found some copper and a little bit of bauxite, which is also aluminum, which will be very handy later on once I start making machinery. Another cool thing about this mod pack is that there's actually a mod that adds flowing rivers that actually flow in a specific direction, as you can see here. And I knew that I wanted to live near one because they actually work with water wheels, which is something I'll be needing later on to generate power. And they also just look really cool. They make these cool formations in the rock that they go through. The sun was beginning to set and an evening breeze had started in the forest, blowing the leaves all over the place from the trees, and it looked very pretty. But I also realized that I was completely out of thirst, I guess. I had to go grab some water and dodge a ton of mobs, which was a little bit difficult, but I finally was able to obtain some saplings from trees because I've been having trouble with that before. and I was able to replant a tree. The next day I wasted no time in making a sleeping bag because I could have made a bed, but you can just put the sleeping bag down anywhere and then it goes back into your inventory and it looks pretty cool. And then I started digging out a little area on the bank of the river and the overhang of the cliff, where I would eventually set up a house. I crafted my first iron pickaxe to test and see if I could get cobble from breaking stone, but I could only get rocks, so I ended up disabling that part of the mod because I figured that it would make sense to get cobble once you had an iron pickaxe. And then I explored the second village that was near my area and got some more loot from one of the houses. And there was even a blacksmith, but I started to overheat, and I had to get out of there and cool down fast. While exploring the surrounding area, I found these giant draft horse things, and then I decided to get some clay because I knew I'd need lots of bricks for my base. Bricks would be a fairly crucial building block, so I decided to start getting them early, and I even had our first rainstorm. And then I took a trip down the river on a boat, and if you go downstream on a boat on a flowing river, you go really fast, and it is very satisfying, as you can see. I finally evolved past whacking logs with my hatchet and decided to make a saw, and then I was able to use my sleeping bag for the first time to sleep the night. I didn't do a ton on day 4 except get some iron armor and explore, but towards the end of the day I did notice that we were starting to create a small pollution cloud over my furnaces of sulfur and carbon. As I'm sure you've noticed, I don't have a mini-map mod because when you're in real life you don't have a mini-map in your peripheral vision, but there was something else that I could make that required redstone, which I went strip mining for, and sugarcane, and that's what I set out to make on day 5. I started by crafting a compass and combining it with a book to get an empty antique atlas, and this would allow me to see the surrounding area in the form of an evolving map over time, and it just shows rough outlines of where you are. You can add markers, and it's generally really helpful. So when you're playing with the weather mod that I have installed, having a weather radar is absolutely essential because you don't want to be taken by surprise by a tornado that could rip through your area and destroy the land at any moment. So I took preventative measures and made a weather radar right away. And to finish out the day, I made a few path designs for the area around my base so that I could start making it look nicer. And would you look at that, mere minutes after I made the weather radar, it came in handy because it displayed this rainstorm that was over my house. And you can actually see exactly where it's moving if you look at it closely. Ah, day 6, I remember this day. This was the day where I had my first brush with death. I spent the rest of day 6 and pretty much all of day 7 just gathering resources and food, but at the end of the day on day 7 I decided to check my nutrition for the first time to see how we were doing on our 5 food categories. The nutrition system is very important for several reasons because one, if you get too low on any of them, it becomes really not fun and you'll just get poisoned, but if you are at 100% on any of them, you get additional health. So keeping them up is very important. And the way that you keep it up is by eating different food with different nutrients, because each food has different assigned nutrients that go with it. Some foods have multiple. And I also set out to make a farm so that I could grow food to eat. But there was a more urgent reason for that, because winter would be coming soon, and not all food grows during the winter. Actually, almost no food does. And I needed to have a stockpile of food to survive the winter. I carried my farming operations over to day 9, and I expanded my farms, got some wheat, so that I could attempt to breed the local cows, but it's not as simple as it might seem because these cows, and all animals, are much more realistic. They need food, water, they need to be happy, and they also need a few other conditions which are difficult to meet. I also began planting the field of industrial hemp because it's incredibly useful for making various machine components later on, and I also got poisoned and took a ton of damage from a stupid dart frog, which I accidentally ran over. Luckily, in terms of gathering meat, there was an alternative in the form of ground traps that you can put bait in and it will passively collect meat and other animal items over time. I honestly didn't do very much on day 10. I made a small tree farm and I set up the ground trap, but I didn't realize it was positioned wrongly until much later. I do eventually realize though. And on day 11, I started bone mealing my industrial hemp so that I could get some of it faster, because you can actually just break the top of it and it will give you seeds and the string, fiber stuff. And I also made a cow pen and shoved my cows into there so that I could hopefully breed them at some point and get milk, because you can't even obtain milk from the female cows until they've been bred and have a baby cow. That evening, I began researching the first machine I would need, the coke oven, which has a couple uses. The major one being to produce coal coke, which you can use to make steel. We'll get to that much later on in the video. And it can also be used to make treated wood because it produces creosote oil as a byproduct. and I went to grab sand, but ended up having to fight a horde of mobs instead, and it was very annoying. I had a few plans in mind for what I wanted to do with my base, so I took a little look around behind my current house, and I had an unfortunate accident with a creeper, which resulted in my sugarcane being blown up because I was just barely too far away to hit it and stop it. The neat thing was that I was finally able to obtain 27 coke bricks, which would allow me to build the coke oven to produce creosote oil and other useful things. And so I put in my 5 blocks of coal and proceeded to wait and do other stuff while that cooked very slowly. And I discovered you could produce milk with almonds, which would be an alternative to my cows because I had been unsuccessful still with breeding them. And so I spent much of day 13 looking for an almond tree, and I had no luck in finding almonds. But it was nice to return back to my house halfway through the day and discover that my cow was actually pregnant, meaning that I'd be able to get milk from the cow soon, which would solve my dairy problems in my nutrition table. And then I made a poor choice regarding this Enderman. You see, I thought that it would be okay to be able to attack this guy without putting him in a boat, but I was wrong. Luckily, it wasn't a big deal getting my stuff back, and I ended up just moving on and crafting a saddle instead so that I could ride a horse and go faster. And right before I went to sleep, I decided to check my coke oven, and sure enough, I actually had some creosote oil and a block of coal coke. The next morning, I set about to obtain a horse, and I exacted my revenge on the skeleton for shooting the sleeping draft horse right in front of my face. But then I was able to actually put my saddle on it, and I could ride it, although it's a little bit different from riding a normal horse. You can't really jump in the same way. And I also made a jerry can, which is basically a bucket but like really big, so that I could hold lots of creosote oil, and I used that creosote oil to make treated wood to make windmill blades because I would need that windmill for some power. And then I needed to make a kinetic dynamo to go with my windmill so I could actually obtain power from it. And it took a lot of microcrafting involving copper, but it would allow me to generate power with the wind. I checked my nutrition and some of the levels were very low, which was concerning. I'd have to get better nutrition very soon if I wanted to not get poisoned. And I spent the rest of that day working on improving my house. I made a little brick area at the back so that you could actually run through the cliff. Day 15, I noticed a worrying cloud of pollution over the coke oven and then proceeded to completely ignore it and make a better storage system and run back and forth transporting items all day. I was unpleasantly surprised to remember that you have to use trapped chests if you want to place checks directly next to each other, and I had to complete my storage system. But I did finally make the engineer's manual, which basically shows me everything that I can make from the immersive engineering mods. And then at long last there was a baby cow. Actually, there were 2 baby cows, and I could finally get milk and solve my dairy problems. I wouldn't have to worry about that anymore. I then proceeded to drink milk for like 5 minutes so that I can increase my dairy levels. And yeah, that was about all that I did the rest of the day. The following day was marked by 2 major events. The first one was finding diamonds, although it was only 2 of them, so not terribly helpful, but it was definitely better than no diamonds. And the second event was actually getting stuff from my ground trap. I was very excited to see it working after I'd fixed it, and this allowed me on day 18 to make my first somewhat complicated food item. I created meaty stew, which would give me grain and protein, 2 nutrients at the same time, and it also restored a little bit more hunger. Next, I began experimenting with what I wanted my walls to be, and I decided that I'd use concrete from immersive engineering, not vanilla concrete, but actual concrete. I was greeted by an uninvited guest the next morning in the form of a creeper that came down the river and managed to get in my boat, and that was just not going to happen. I already had my sugarcane blow up one time. And you thought I forgot about my windmill? No, I did not. I just had been putting it off, and I had to gather some more supplies to make it actually usable in the form of various wires and wire connectors. But I ended up pillaring up with some treated fences, and I placed down a kinetic dynamo and placed my windmill off the side of that, and it started turning, and it was beautiful, although it's not terribly fast at the moment because it doesn't have any windmill sails. But that's where our industrial hemp will come in later. I also made this external heater which, when powered and placed next to a furnace, will make the furnace run as though it had fuel, but it just runs off of power instead. So this would eliminate some of my coal needs, and I could divert more coal into producing coal coke. And then I tested out the heater by smelting a piece of stone just using the power produced by the windmill, although it is not enough currently to make the heater run constantly. It will drain the power and slow down. Day 20 saw us back in the mines looking for resources, and I actually did a neat clutch here. I might have died if I'd failed that, but clutches aside, I ended up finding some cool stuff underground. I actually found emerald because I ended up going into like a highlands or something, some mountain biome, and a few other things. But I generally needed lots of resources if I wanted to make all the machines and everything that I would need. And I also got jump scared by this weird zombie that was invisible and snuck up on me. That was not cool. My mining expeditions from the day before carried over into the next day, and I remained underground and found this neat, like, dungeon thingy. The funny thing is I didn't add any structure generation mods, so I still don't know what added this, but there was a bunch of zombie spawners, and I was able to get some neat loot from it. Back on the surface that evening, I found a normal vanilla horse that spawned, and it turned out to be much faster than the draft horse, which was a good thing, although it could barely jump. And then I took all the stuff I'd mined and put it in my very slow smelting system powered by one windmill. The next morning, it became very evident that fall had arrived. All the trees were starting to turn orange, and this meant that winter would be coming soon, and I would have to be able to stay warm and grow enough food. I went back mining again because I needed more clay and pretty much more of everything. And I remained underground for several days, mining coal, iron, and pretty much anything I could find. I even found some sulfur ore, which produced clouds of sulfur, unsurprisingly. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised when I almost got hyperthermia from sitting near lava for a long time mining stuff, but I was able to survive just by sitting in a waterfall for a little bit and cooling down. On my way out, I broke a vine and ended up getting a white sprout, and it showed that I could eat it, so I tried eating it, and it gave me the whitening status effect. I have no idea what this did. Babies, what do you guys in the comments can tell me if you know, but I thought it was just kind of interesting. Even several days after I put the stuff in to smelt, it wasn't even close to being done. I crafted a diamond pickaxe using literally all my diamonds that I'd gotten from mining, and I set about making a bit more food because I was preparing to go to the nether. Day 25, I started working on my house a little bit more. I've been working on it a little bit over time, and I just was slowly improving it to make it more livable. I also went back to one of the villages nearby, and I found that a ton of food had grown, and I was able to harvest a massive amount of wheat and a pretty decent amount of carrots. The wheat would continue to grow throughout the fall as that's one of its fertile seasons, so I'd be able to harvest more of it over time. At this point, much of my progression was blocked by a lack of blaze rods and blaze powder, because I needed that to craft a blast furnace so that I could produce steel. So I used the obsidian that I mined to make another portal, and I would attempt to go to the nether to see if I could obtain some blaze powder. I was at last able to make my first of many windmill sails and attach it to my windmill because windmills by themselves do not produce a lot of power and they're not very efficient, but if you add sails, they become much better at producing power. Day 26 was a very important day because I would finally enter the nether. However, there were several problems I suspected I would encounter, and I was not disappointed. You see, the nether is full of lava, and lava produces heat, and when you get overheated, you also start to get dehydrated. I'd been in the nether for about a minute and I was already overheating and dehydrating, and to make matters worse, I couldn't see a fortress anywhere nearby. And I certainly couldn't survive for the long period of time necessary it would take to find a fortress, so I was forced to return to the overworld. I began researching cooling methods immediately, and unfortunately they require ice cubes, which I do not have. And there's actually a suit of armor that allows you to stay cool, but it requires slime in addition to the ice cube, so I was not able to make anything at this point. On the bright side, I was able to make an engineer's toolbox, which would allow me to store food and wiring and tools and neat stuff like that and just carry around in my inventory. At this point, I knew I couldn't do much about my ice problems until winter arrived, so I started looking into ways of storing water. I made this water tank that you can store 12 buckets of water in, and I realized that you can also get water bottles and drink them and it does restore your water, which made sense, but I wanted to make sure. Unfortunately, when I tried to take the water out of the tank, it didn't give me water bottles back, but I somehow ended up taking out an uncraftable potion from the tank. I don't understand why this worked or why it happened, but all I knew is that it did actually restore my water, so apparently I would be taking water tanks into the nether and drinking uncraftable potions. The next day I checked my nutrition to see how I was doing, and I was doing okay, but it could be a lot better. So instead of actually solving my nutritional problems, I decided to make another windmill instead because I knew that I would need a lot more power. I was barely getting enough power as is for my one smelting array. But I decided to go a step further by creating my first power grid, because I'd made these wooden posts that you can put on the ground and attach wire connectors and relays to, so that it keeps the wires overhead and not a hazard. I wired in both windmills to connect to my smelting things, so it did smelt a little bit faster, but it still wasn't producing enough power to fully maintain the external heater. And that's when I noticed it. My temperature bar showed the first freeze. Winter had finally come, and I was starting to freeze at nighttime. This was both a good and bad thing because it meant that I'd be able to obtain ice soon, but also no food would grow and I'd have to survive on what I already gathered. I then made an engineer's workbench, which allows you to make some more complicated things to make vacuum tubes so that I can make these powered lanterns, because a really cool thing about them is, in addition to giving off light, they also stop mob spawning in a 32 block radius around them, meaning that my area would be safer from mobs once I installed them. And at the end of day 29, I added my first powered lantern near my windmill area, and there it goes. On day 30, I wanted to explore over the giant hills near my house and see what was behind them. And I found something very cool. I found a redwood forest, which not only looks really cool, but you can get a massive amount of wood from it because each redwood tree drops a huge amount of logs. Also found this neat biome that was past the forest that contained spruce trees, and I even found a village not far after that, but by this time night had fallen and it was starting to get cold. I unwisely made the choice of doing some mining instead of going to shelter immediately, and I started to get very cold. And not long after, hypothermia set in, and I had no way of warming up. I desperately tried to sleep the night away with my sleeping bag, but every time I took damage, it would reset my sleeping. And then I remembered there's one thing that could save me. If I could craft a campfire in time, I would be able to go next to it and it would warm me up just enough so that I wouldn't freeze to death. But then it wasn't lit, I had to light it, and if I hadn't had flint and steel, then I probably would have died. I was so lucky to have flint and steel in my engineer's toolbox, but that's why I made it, so I could carry handy tools and have them anytime I needed them. Eventually the hypothermia went away and I was able to sleep. But after that, I never went exploring or did anything at nighttime without carrying campfires with me. The next morning I wanted to continue exploring, and I found a convenient lava pool that I could warm up in, but my horse decided it had enough of freezing and decided to take a bath in the lava instead, and it died, losing me my gold horse armor and my only saddle at the time. This was very frustrating because I couldn't travel as fast, and I would expend more food over time. After much more traveling, I came across a savanna and a savanna village, which was a very good sign because I was looking for a desert so that I could obtain cactus and lots of sand. I snagged a little bit more loot from a nice house in the savanna village and proceeded to spend a part of the night mining sand. By morning, my sand mining had led me to some jasper, which I thought would be cool to collect because it looked really nice and I figured I could decorate with it. And I was able to get another horse, although it was a modded horse, which wasn't as good, but it was better than not having any horse at all. By the time night arrived, I was almost home, but I started dying of hypothermia again. But this time, I was able to make it home in time. On the morning of day 33, I found a frozen pond in the hills, and was finally able to obtain ice cubes from the ice. This meant that I'd be able to continue my exploits in the nether, because it would allow me to make a cooling coil. And this I quickly made, and I tested out. However, when I took it to the nether and stood next to it, I still increased in temperature, so it did not fully stop me from overheating, it just made it slower. I looked a little bit more closely at the gelled slime armor, and I realized that it was possible to obtain slime through a jellyfish, which is why I spent much of the next day fishing so that I can make fish bait for a fish trap and hopefully catch some jellyfish. Day 35 saw the introduction of a ventilation system to my house area so that any pollution caused by my furnaces would be sucked up and vented out a chimney at the top of my house. I also started using some jasper bricks for the roof, and I discovered that it looked pretty nice. I also checked my fish trap, however, it hadn't caught any jellyfish yet. Due to the continued lack of slime, I decided to craft a nature's compass, which basically allows me to search for any biome in the game, and it will point in that direction and tell me the coordinates. So I searched for a swamp, and was able to find one not too far away. I somehow ran into a pool of poisoned water as well, which was not a pleasant experience. And that afternoon, on my way back, we had our first snowstorm in the prairie. Later that day, I returned back to the swamp. However, I was unsuccessful at obtaining slime, and I barely managed to stay alive because of the cold. I ended up back in the nether the next day because I needed to obtain some magma shards for heating coils to keep me warm in the overworld. I was able to spot another fortress though, which was nice, although it was pretty far away. And then, right as I was returning to my portal, I was finally saved. I found this other mob that drops blaze powder, and I realized that it might not be impossible to obtain that blaze powder. Back home at my base, I crafted 2 heating coils using my magma shards, which would allow me to stay warm even during the cold winter nights. And I actually found a couple blazes that spawned outside of a fortress. Apparently one of the mods adds that as a feature, and I was able to get 1 blaze rod from that. I also found a few more of the foxhounds on the way back to my portal and got even more blaze powder, and at this point I was really close to having enough to be able to make my blast furnace. I also looked at some recipes for things that I can make with wheat because I had a ton of wheat, and I got the last harvest of crops from the nearby village that were still growing before the winter. And then I realized I could use 1 carrot to make 3 stock, which is actually slightly better than the carrot by itself. So I ate that for a little while. And after one last trip to the nether, I was able to obtain the final bit of blaze powder that I needed to make my blast furnace. I at last had 12 blaze powder, and I made it back to the overworld before I died of hypothermia. The morning of day 39 saw 27 blast bricks being created, which would allow me to make my blast furnace at last. I set it up by my coke oven over in the field, and I started smelting some iron into steel right away using a bunch of the coal coke that I had been saving up over time. I eventually got around to making a better bridge after using a cobblestone thing for ages, and I set up a nice powered lantern on it so that it would look cool and mobs wouldn't spawn. And after enough time, I was able to get my first steel, 7 steel ingots. I did something a little bit different on day 40 and just looked at the world briefly with shaders on, and boy did it look really pretty, with the sun sliding down the hillside behind me. On day 41, I returned to the redwood forest and chopped down one singular tree and got 94 logs from it, and I was able to replant like 3 times as many trees with all the saplings that got dropped. I also took down the blast furnace after getting 27 steel from it because I was going to make it into an improved blast furnace which would smelt the steel even faster and more efficiently. Unfortunately, that required steel to begin with, but I was able to set it up after getting sieged by mobs. Unfortunately, continued use of my coke oven and blast furnace was beginning to create a sizable pollution cloud over the field, so I began setting up a water wheel instead, which would not produce any pollution and it would give me more power. Since you can attach 3 water wheels to one dynamo, I was able to make even more power than I anticipated, with the added bonus of it looking really cool in the river at the back of my base. Later in the day, I went back to the mines, and I didn't have to worry about freezing because it's warmer, closer to a bedrock level, and I was able to find some diamonds, and I mined some so that I could make an enchantment table and make enchantments finally. I also raided the nearby villages for bookshelves instead of trying to get the leather myself because that would be very time consuming. I ended up getting some okay enchantments like Fortune 2, and I decided to take it, and I was able to get a Silk Touch pickaxe, so I went back and mined the diamonds because I had a different plan for what I'd do with them to get more diamonds from each ore. I took advantage of the increase in heat near bedrock level and spent the next 2 days mining, partially so that I wouldn't freeze to death and partially because I needed a lot of stuff. And I also found this weird monster box thing which spawned a ton of zombies and a few other mobs, but I don't think I even got hit one time while fighting them. Unfortunately, it didn't really give me anything, so it was just kind of like rotten flesh and experience. But then I did find something very unique, which was this weird terracotta cave that was full of water, but it also had slime blocks in it, and I have no idea what added this. I've never seen it before in modded Minecraft, but it did mean that my slime troubles would be over, and I'd be able to make that gelled slime suit of armor so I could stay cool in the nether and hopefully obtain more blaze rods and other useful items. Immediately upon returning to the surface, again, I got hypothermia, and I had to make it back to my base fast. But when I did get there, I unpacked my big haul of stuff that I'd gotten down in the mines, using my handy storage crates, which are basically just the discount shulker boxes. The following morning, I began researching a world spike, which is basically a chunk loader, because my farming area was a little bit too far away from my base to be able to be loaded all the time. And I was lucky enough to find an enderman and get an ender pearl that evening, so that the next day I was able to make a personal world spike. Unfortunately for me, it required fuel, and I thought that that would just be coal or something simple, but no, it was not, and I'm still not quite sure what you use for fuel. But one good thing that did come out of that day was the garden cloche, a machine that would not only aid me in food production, but also power production over the coming days. With more power soon to be at my disposal, I began researching the first heavy machine that I'd make, the crusher. But I would also need a place to put that machine, which is why I started making the outline of my factory building that would house all of my heavy machinery in the days to come. On the morning of day 49, I noticed something very important. All the grass and leaves and everything were not as brown as it had been before, meaning that springtime was not far off. I also began making a ton of concrete for the floor of my factory, using slag for my blast furnace and a bunch of clay and other materials. And late that night, I hooked up my garden cloche and tested it out for the first time. All that it needs is water, power, and some dirt, and then whatever seeds that you want it to grow. And so I added water to the back of it, connected it to my water wheel, and I put in a piece of dirt and industrial hemp seeds, and I waited for it to grow. And sure enough, it produced the industrial hemp fibers and the seeds. Using my newfound wealth of hemp fibers from my garden clothes, I was able to add more windmill sails to my windmills, and I also checked my nutrition and did a little bit of research on food, and I discovered that Yorkshire pudding would not be too difficult to make, and it would supply 3 of the nutrients that I needed. Later that evening, I checked my cloche again and found that I had a bunch of hemp fibers, and I was able to use that to make a ton of string for bait for my trap, so that I could collect even more meat. The next morning, I wanted to add some powered lamps inside my base, and I got them all connected up, but I realized that if I used normal wires, I would constantly damage myself, so I swapped them out for insulated wires instead. I also reworked the wiring for my garden cloche so that it would connect to the overall power grid instead of just having the water wheel go to the cloche. One of the ingredients that I need for Yorkshire pudding was eggs, and I realized that I could use the eggs that I had obtained already to spawn just some normal Minecraft chickens instead of the modded chickens, and I could have an infinite egg farm, so I made a little area of my factory for that. And I fed the baby chicken half a stack of seeds to make it grow up really quickly, and I got a ton of milk for my Yorkshire pudding. And at the end of the day, I was able to craft a decent bit of it. Now that I had an area to put some of my machines in my factory building, I moved over my smelting array, and I used some of the bricks I got from it to expand my path at the back of my house. I also added on to my lighting system, and I brought my wires into the factory building so I could finally have power there, although there was a temporary setup at the time because I would make it a little bit better once I had walls. I also moved my garden cloche over so that all my machines would be in one spot, and the next day I got my first chicken egg from my chicken farm. Conveniently, the engineer's manual shows all the materials that you need for each different multi-block, and I began getting the materials I would need for the crusher, which required a lot of iron and steel, but luckily I'd been saving up for a long time to be able to make this, because the reason I needed the crusher is that if you put one ore into the crusher, you'll get 2 powdered versions of that ore, meaning you can double the output of everything you mine. On day 55, I assembled our very first large multi-block machine, the crusher, which would allow me to double my ore output and thereby get the resources I needed for the excavator even faster. Unfortunately, it requires a lot of power, a little bit more than I had at my disposal, even from several windmills and water wheels. But the good thing about it is that it will still run even if it doesn't have a lot of power. It just slows down a lot. So I was able to begin doubling my ore, but it just took a long time. I spent much of the next day buried in the engineer's manual trying to figure out which method of power production would be easier, and I ended up settling on a diesel generator because I could have made a giant steam turbine, but that would take way more materials, but I would have to make several processing things for the oil to actually make the diesel to run the generator. I also finally got around to upgrading my gear to steel, including my armor, which is a little bit worse than diamond, but it has a lot more durability than iron, and it has the added bonus of looking pretty fancy. By this point, spring had fully arrived, and everything was looking green, and the ice had melted from the nearby areas of water. My biggest concern was just waiting for my crusher to very slowly double my ore, so I ended up mining some andesite and doing some enchanting in the meantime. And I took that andesite and started building the corners of the walls for my factory building. Now that I had a crusher, I could take the diamond ore that I had silk touched a while ago and put it in the crusher so that I'd double all of it, which is a 100% guarantee, because I figured that was slightly safer than doing Fortune 2. But anyways, I transferred all the powdered ore over to my single furnace smelting system so it could slowly begin smelting over time. And then late that night, I made some more windmills in preparation for the next day when I'd hopefully expand my power grid and be able to power my crusher more effectively. I started right away setting up windmills on day 59 and started to connect them to the power grid. My main goal was to be able to get enough power to run the crusher at full speed and not have it be extremely slow, but at least in their current state without sails, the windmills were not enough to fully supply the crusher with enough power. Day 60 was a day of resource gathering where I went back to the redwood forest, and this time I got 145 logs from one tree, which was even more than last time. Then I went into a cave system for the rest of the day and just kind of ran around getting more iron and stuff that I could put in my crusher. But at one point I messed up the water in my water bucket and lost it, and so I had to run out of the cave and find water really fast. Although despite the arrival of spring, it was still cold enough in the mountains and at night time to make freezing a danger. I worked on enchanting some of my steel armor after I got back from resource gathering, and I did some little odd jobs around the factory building, like adding more external heaters and stuff like that to the furnaces, although unfortunately I did not have enough power yet to turn them all on. I also was slowly working on adding bricks around the outside of the building so that it become safe, because there's still ways for mobs to get in, but we were really close to making it safe. In order to make more heavy machinery, I knew I'd need to increase my steel output, which meant that I'd need more coal coke, so I started researching the advanced coke oven to be able to produce it faster. I also started laying out window areas in the wall so that I know where not to build, so I could put windows in the future. I got all the materials I needed for the advanced coke oven. It wasn't too bad. It was about the same as a blast furnace. And then shortly thereafter, I noticed that the sky was getting kind of dark, and I wasn't sure if a storm was forming. And it turned out just to be a rainstorm, so I wouldn't need it quite yet, but I would be needing it in the days to come. I was still faced with the problem of not being able to survive for long periods of time in the nether, so I used some of the slime and the ice cubes I gathered over the winter to make some gelled slime armor. Unfortunately, I had to go back to not recently loaded chunks to get some ice from them before it all melted. But in the end, I was able to make a full set of gelled slime armor in preparation for going back to the nether the following day. The following morning, I got all geared up in my gelled slime armor, got my cooling coil and a ton of water bottles and stuff, and I headed back to the nether because I was going to get to that fortress this time. I tested out my gelled slime armor next to the cooling coil, and it actually allowed me to cool down, which was a first. So I was able to get some basalt, which I'd need for building later on, and I made my way to the fortress. Along the way, I came across this ash biome, and I almost fell into lava pools, and I would have 100% died if I had, so I was really lucky to avoid that. I grabbed some bone blocks as well from this weird, like, flesh biome thing, and I turned into a vampire because I realized that you can use empty bottles on blood pools, and it just gives you water bottles, so neat. It did end up restoring my thirst, which was nice, meaning that I could stay longer, and I had to bridge out over lava to the nether fortress. The fortress was kind of I found like one diamond in a loot chest, and I kind of was running out of the water at that point, so I decided to head back. And back at my base, I used some of the basalt to make it look like the bricks behind my furnaces were all blackened. I also made this like really weird conveyor belt contraption thing for my super smelter, which would just move the items around in an endless loop, but they would never despawn because they kept going in and out of a chest. I also made these cool double door things that are 3 blocks wide for my factory, which look pretty cool. And I built up the walls a little bit higher behind the furnaces with the basalt. And then I had to start researching the first heavy machine that I'd need for the oil processing in order to fuel the diesel generator, and that was the pump jack. I was forced to make heavy engineering blocks as well for the first time, which are very expensive and required electrum, which I could only get by making an alloy kiln, so I had to do that as well. Electrum is made from silver and gold in the alloy kiln, and I got some the next morning after waiting for it to smelt overnight, and I finished getting all the materials I would need for the pump jack. I also added a second set of water wheels off the side of my base to get even more power because I'd be needing it in the coming days. I spent 3 full days just mining to get 5 stacks of iron at the very least, which I could turn into 10 stacks of ingots by doubling it in my crusher. I tried to make this the last time I'd have to go resource gathering underground in this 100 days, and I was able to be successful. All in all, I ended up with a ton of resources from that 3 days. Lots and lots of ore, which I'd use in machines, and tons of clay to turn into bricks for my factory building. I got to watch my clay go round in a circle the next day on my conveyor belt for my super smelter, which was very fun to watch. And I collected a ton of industrial hemp fiber from my garden close, and I started working on making some stuff for more windmills because I still needed more power. And then that evening, I noticed something ominous in the distance. There were clouds swirling, and I checked my radar, and there was a Category 3 tornado moving toward me very slowly, but it was making a beeline for my position. I took my horse, and I saw it a little bit closer up, and it was still in unloaded chunks, but it was definitely heading my way, and I could see it destroyed the forest as I got into loaded chunks. All the leaves and everything were stripped off that forest, and that's exactly what would happen to the area around me if I hadn't made that weather deflector, which prevents block damage. I also decided to make a second one and put it in my factory building just in case the radius of the other one wasn't very big, but then I had to go back into my base soon because I started seeing mobs fly into the air, like my horse. I forgot about my horse being out in the open, and it got picked up by the tornado. By morning it was almost on me, and I could not go outside because I'd immediately get picked up by it. At one point my horse randomly landed on the ground in front of me, and I was like, oh, my horse will be saved, we're good. But then it got picked up again only moments later. And unfortunately I never saw that horse ever again, which was very sad because it was a good horse. The only block damage that it caused afterward was it just stripped all the grass off of the dirt blocks and turned them back into dirt, which looked extremely weird having the actual grass blocks themselves, like the transparent ones that you can walk through, actually still there. It's very odd. But anyways, I set about setting up my windmills, which is what I meant to do originally. And I worked a little bit more on the wall section for my base. And by day 73, I had got about half of the walls done and looking pretty decent, although I still needed glass for the windows. On day 74, I finally got all the concrete placed in for the floor of my factory building, which was long overdue considering I started it like 20 days ago or something. And I also got a bunch of bricks from my smelter system, which would be very useful for finishing the walls. And I finally picked a window pattern, which was like some leaded glassing, which looked really cool. I also noticed that all my chickens were dead thanks to the tornado, which is not something I expected, but I was able to replenish my stock of chickens with eggs that they already had laid. All my windmills and water wheels I've been making over time finally rewarded me the next morning because my crusher would actually work non-stop now without slowing down and running out of power, which meant that I could crush my ore even faster. I also set out on an expedition to go find terracotta, and I originally was going to find a mesa, and I started to go in that direction, but I found this other, like, desert-related biome thing instead that was full of terracotta, so I just stayed there for several days and mined enough to get 18 stacks. Because I'd need terracotta for the roof of my factory building, because I already knew what block I'd use. One really nice thing was that I got a new horse while I was gone on my expedition, because my other horse had just vanished. I still never found out what happened to it. And it was a really fast horse, which made traveling very easy. And later that evening, I set out again on an expedition, this time for an ocean so that I could kill squid and get a ton of black dye, because I would be using black terracotta. I got about 2 stacks of dye before heading back, and on the return journey, I found another village that had this nice, like, railcraft little house in it, and it had a manual rolling machine, which would mean that I could make minecart rails if I ever needed to. I looked at the block I'd be using when I got back on the next day, and it looked pretty nice. So I started filling in the roof with it, and I just had a little bit extra, a little bit more than I needed. I was very concerned that I wouldn't have enough and I'd have to go all the way back, but I was lucky and I did not have to do that. But the thing about having a roof now meant that any pollution that got created inside my factory building would not go up into the sky and get blown away by the wind eventually. It'd kind of just sit there, so I'd have to add a ventilation system soon. But I had better things to do that day, like admiring all the grit that I'd obtained from my crusher and dumping all of it into my super smelter. And then I also had to finish building up the little wall areas where the walls met the roof. But it was a bit difficult because I kept standing in pollution and I kept getting blindness and mining fatigue and some other nasty stuff. By this point, my nutrients were looking pretty good, and I had an extra 8 hearts, which was really nice because I'd have to start tanking pollution damage pretty soon. And later that evening, I started making a little scaffolding walkway area up in the ceiling so that I could hang lights and wire relays and stuff off of it. And I also made a ventilation system, but it wasn't super effective. It got the pollution out eventually, but it wasn't amazing. And I had to make a little chimney, mostly just because it would look cool, and then I fell off the roof. While I was doing all that building, all my grits and stuff were smelting into ingots, and I had a big collection of ingots that I could use. I went out and grabbed some more wood and almost got crushed by a tree. I narrowly avoided that. But by then, I was basically ready to start building my heavy machinery. And I also got a good look at the pollution cloud from far away, and it's not even that bad yet. I'm sure at least someone has already screamed in the comments that I should make a metal press, and yes, I know I've played Aversive Engineering before. I just didn't get around to it for a while. But anyways, day 83, made a metal press, and if you don't know what that is, it basically just allows you to make plates and gears and wires and other things more easily, and you don't have to use like crafting recipes to make it. I started reworking my power system inside the factory by putting relays on the ceiling off the little girders that I added so that I could get power more easily to all the different machines. And I also added a capacitor bank so it would kind of have like a certain amount of power always stored in case something happened to like disrupt my power supply. And I made my first metal plates using the metal press, which then I turned into a fluid tank so that I'd have a place to store all the massive amounts of creosote oil that I was creating from my coke oven. It was satisfying watching the creosote oil go into the tank because you can view how much is in it in real time when you hold a bucket in your hand. And then I decided to juice the output of my coke oven even more by adding some preheaters to it, which would basically just speed up the process at the cost of a little bit of power. To be honest, I did almost nothing noteworthy on day 85 except add some lights to the outside of my building. But on day 86 and 87, I was gathering materials for my distillation tower, which was another machine that I needed to refine the crude oil that you get from the pump jack and turned it into usable things like diesel. After a lot of crafting and a lot of iron and steel, I got all the materials for the distillation tower, and I started getting everything I need for the diesel generator. Unfortunately, by this point, I was low on steel, and having to craft 13 heavy engineering blocks would drain the rest of my steel, meaning I wouldn't be able to fully make the diesel generator at this time. And to solve my steel shortage, I decided to make preheaters for the blast furnace as well, which basically do the same thing as I do to the coke oven and speed up the smelting time of the iron into steel. And at the end of the day, I made a very crucial machine which would help me the next day, a core sample drill. And basically what you can do with this is you put it on the ground in just any chunk, and you can give it power, and it'll basically take a sample of whatever's underground, like if there's a lot of ore or if there's a lot of a liquid. And in this case, I was looking for crude oil deposits. The first chunk that I found has like iron and stuff like that in it, which isn't terribly helpful at the moment, but I would use it later. The textures for the core samples got a little bit bugged, but I was able to find a chunk that had a lot of crude oil in it after a while, which is where I'd position my pump jack. Having located a deposit of crude oil, the next 3 days were spent in building heavy machinery. I started out by making the pump jack because that would allow me to get crude oil, which I could then start turning into diesel. And by the time I had the generator, I'd have fuel for it. Because I was smart about this, and a long time ago, I made a high voltage capacitor which can store 4 million RF. And basically what I did is I let that charge over time so that I'd have enough power to jumpstart my machines to actually give the diesel generator fuel so that the diesel generator could take over the power generation. And to give it a test run, I hooked up my newly made pump jack to a wooden barrel of all things, and I took my capacitor and attached it to the power input and let it run for a little bit, and it has the coolest animation ever. It looks so good. And you were able to see that I was gaining slowly crude oil in my barrel. But then it was time to build the distillation tower, which was a nightmare of iron sheet metal and steel scaffolding to build. It took a really long time. It was really tall. That clip you just watched is like a quarter of me building it, and it's sped up to 500%. So it was kind of a pain to build, but we finally got the distillation tower. But the cool thing is now I can put power in it, and I can put in crude oil, and it'll separate out the crude oil into gasoline and diesel and lubricant. For my purposes right now, I only need the diesel, so I just have to store the other two fluids because I can't really use them for anything. But I connected up both outputs of the pump jack to the distillation tower so that it would immediately put all the crude oil into the distillation tower. I tested out the pump jack a little bit, and it just put the crude oil right into the internal buffer of the distillation tower. Then when I gave the tower more power, it started separating it out into the 3 different liquids. And at last, after all those machines, I had the infrastructure in place to be able to build the diesel generator and use it once I had it. I had the ability to produce lots of diesel and constantly fuel it. So I built it using tons of heavy engineering blocks and other stuff. And there we have it. Diesel generator has been completed, meaning I can produce enough power to run the excavator once I construct it. I tested it out by putting in the diesel that I'd already collected, and it filled up the capacitor really fast. The next morning I made medium voltage wire stuff and started connecting all my machines up because I took 2 out of the 3 outputs from the diesel generator and I combined them into one line that would go out and power the pump jack and the distillation tower. I also checked the pollution cloud above my factory, and there was a semi-constant stream of pollution reaching it whenever I had the diesel generator active because it produces a huge amount of pollution, and it would quickly become difficult to live in that area. And sure enough, when I ran over there inside the building, I started to get debuffs like weakness and mining fatigue, and it would only get worse from there. Day 39, I made 2 tanks to hold the excess liquids that I had, the gasoline and lubricant, because I don't have a use for them. And I connected up a big pipe from the output of the distillation tower, and it would basically just transfer all of the other things into these tanks, and then it would only divert the diesel into the diesel generator. The next morning, I connected up the pipeline from the distillation tower to the inputs of the diesel generator, and it just constantly inputted the diesel that was being created into the generator, meaning that it was self-sustaining now. I was even able to sit there and watch the gasoline and lubricant being added to the tanks, in addition to the pollution spewing into the sky from my chimney. I quickly turned off the diesel generator though because I didn't have a use for it to be constantly active. I just needed enough to charge some power cells. And then I realized that the pollution was getting to a point where it was killing my chickens. My chickens had straight up died in my chicken farm. I did not expect this to happen. They would have gotten poisoned and then withered eventually. And unfortunately, I was forced to move them. But luckily, there were plenty of eggs. But it was still very sad, and I was taking a ton of damage sitting in there. I moved them to a new safe place in the field, and I just created the chicken farm again. On the morning of day 96, it was time to get the materials for the excavator because I had the infrastructure to run it. I had enough power at this point, but I just had to get all the materials, which was in of itself very time consuming because it's a very large and expensive multi-block machine. It takes a huge amount of steel. The bucket alone takes 20 steel scaffolding and 9 solid blocks of steel, so I ended up having to wait for a little while for my steel to smelt. But I ended up getting provided with a distraction in the form of another tornado on day 97, and this time it went a little bit differently. For one thing, it was not as strong of a tornado as before, but I also managed to get picked up in it while riding my horse, and I just kind of got set into the middle of it, and I flew around for a little bit. And then I started to drift down because it was a pretty weak tornado. and I assumed that I would die, or at the very least my horse would die when I hit the ground, but it wasn't falling very fast, so I didn't die, but my horse got picked up again and I couldn't get back on it. All the other animals around me had died or were taking a ton of damage when they landed, and so I assumed that my horse would die again. This would be the second horse I lost to a tornado. But somehow my horse managed to survive. I found it down at the bottom of the hill, and I was able to ride it to safety inside my factory building. After the events of the previous day in the tornado, enough steel had smelted in the meantime that I was able to make the last bit of materials that I need for the excavator. So on day 98, I set about building it in front of my factory building, in the chunk that I had found a while ago that contained iron and sulfur. It only took me a few tries with the engineer's hammer to figure out where I needed to click to form the multi-block, but when I did, I was well rewarded. And on the morning of the second to last day, after all this time and after all the machines I made, I was able to run the excavator for the first time using my high voltage capacitor, which drained incredibly quickly. It started out by mining dirt in its buckets and outputting dirt out the back, and eventually it got to stone and it would start to give me ore. Out the back is where the stuff gets output, and you can like put a chest there and other stuff, but I didn't feel the need to do that at the moment because it was so near the end of the 100 days, and after about 30 seconds of running, it had just completely drained the entire capacitor that I had, and I was able to obtain some iron ore from it and sulfur. That evening I turned on my shaders that were compatible with all the mods and everything in preparation for the final day so that we could take a cinematic look at the world. And there we have it, the dawn of day 100. I only managed to wreck the environment a little bit, just a little bit. There's definitely not a huge pollution cloud up there that I will 100% die to if I walk under it. But I figured I'd turn on the excavator one more time in honor of the 100th day. There we have it, 100 days survived in the Industrial Revolution. I narrowly made it to day 100 before the area around my factory became too toxic to inhabit. Like I said in the beginning of the video, 10,000 likes and I'll do 200 days where I focus on cleaning up and managing the pollution and finding cleaner methods of producing power. And that doesn't mean just building 100 windmills and water wheels, something way more interesting than that. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and be sure to let me know down in the comments if you want to see more like this in the future. But that's going to be all for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I've been Speed, and I'll see you in the next video or live stream. Bye.